Welcome everyone to today's July 4th, Interdependence Day. Talk on spiritual democracy. It's a really interesting topic. It's a topic that it seems to me when we're speaking of spirit as that which stands behind everything in our manifest world, if there's a spiritual democracy, I wonder whether that which is represented in this democracy is not only all of the people, but maybe everything, all of the animals and all of the resources of this world. Are they somehow represented in a spiritual democracy? And I also wonder, during a time when sometimes I feel as if democracy is under such attack, and sometimes I feel as if there are such vibrant champions of democracy in the political arena, I wonder whether spiritual democracy is possible within less than political democratic organizations. Other forms of government or supposed democracies that aren't functioning at their highest, is spiritual democracy still possible? So I want to have us please welcome Professor Maurice Bisheff, who has given this topic a lot of consideration. He is quite a scholar of one of the founding fathers of the American Revolution, and that is Thomas Paine. In fact, he's intimately involved with the Thomas Paine Society, I believe. And I'm really looking forward to how he is going to kick off our conversation on spiritual democracy.
All right, thank you, Renee. And thank you all for coming on July 4th and giving some of your time to this topic. Really appreciate you being here. You know what they say, you are, therefore I am. So if you weren't here, I wouldn't be here. So thank you. I'm going to proceed a bit, since this is July 4th and the American Revolution, to see what wisdom we can garner from the revolutionary tradition. And in particular, I've chosen Thomas Paine, but I will also mention the Iroquois Confederation. And they were very important both in spiritual democracy and in giving Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin and others an idea about how to make it happen. And both of them tend to be ignored, along with the contributions of France and the Marquis de Lafayette. If it weren't for the French, we wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War, but no one ever talks about our gratitude toward the French. But this isn't the nation that's necessarily grounded on too much gratitude, unfortunately. But be that as it may, so I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about Thomas Paine and how he kind of represents in his ideas and through his own words, one idea of spiritual democracy. Mention the Iroquois Indian toward the end and their confederation. And then finally, deal with the first modern labor union organizer of India, who's also a philosopher, who gives a definition of democracy and seems to hit the nail on the head as to maybe what the conditions are for a true spiritual democracy. So hopefully that'll all happen in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. There's no expert on the subject, and so it's always a delight to dive into something like this. So we can begin then with Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine was a very mysterious, yet forthright and transparent man. He's considered a great revolutionary adept of the 17th century. He was born in 1737 and he died in 1805. And he stated, "My country is the world and my religion is to do good." So he was really, even back then, without radio or any media, but steamship at best, not even steamship actually, a great revolutionary and global citizen. And he really had an amazing life. He fueled the spiritual and government revolution in the American colonies, even giving the name of the United States of America to us. He influenced the British thinking, but had to flee to France to evade a charge of treason, punishable by death, and barely made it. He didn't speak much French, but he was elected to the French Assembly and then helped draft the, not the Declaration of Human Rights, but the Rights of Man that came out of pre-revolutionary France. But then he got caught up in the Reign of Terror and was thrown in the Bastille. And he was about ready to be guillotined as they walked down every morning into the different cells. Somehow the mark above his cell changed. And so when the guards went, they saw that it wasn't the mark for guillotine. And that was the reason, or one of the reasons, why he was able to survive in France at that time, the Reign of Terror. And he eventually came back to the United States to his longtime friend, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the few friends that held with him from start to finish, and mentioned to Jefferson about the Louisiana Purchase and that Napoleon in France needed some money. And so he wound up with Thomas Jefferson working with and influencing the Louisiana Purchase of the United States, which extended it about halfway in territory across the whole land. So that was kind of quite a life for one life. And that's kind of the history of him. And during the, while he was in France, he did pen a couple books called The Age of Reason and The Rights of Man. And he was quite those books and he were quite influential. And that spurred a whole revolutionary tradition. So Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin in South America read this and were very inspired. European intellectuals, including the Marquis de Lafayette, were very inspired. And in fact, even as far as Russia, intellectuals were talking about this book. Because Paine represented the move away from just accepting a feudal system and a king just for the sake of the fact that there was a king and a feudal system, and that was tradition and conformity and feudal hierarchies. Everyone were serfs and were tied to the land and bowed down to their master, and all throughout Europe. And in fact, the colonizing urge, of course, extended after that all through Asia as well. So Paine was very much against this, and he helped initiate a long arc of a new kind of politics, from elitism to equality, as Professor Raghavan Iyer states, a revolution that's still going on today, right? From elitism to equality and for universal human rights. And Paine spoke about it back then. So who was Thomas Paine? He was born an Englishman in 1737. He spent his life, half of his life in England, where he was a staymaker, a tax collector, and a great orator and debater in the pubs of London. He was self-taught, but he was exposed growing up to the cruelties of an arbitrary king and arbitrary justice. So he saw people outside of his window being hanged. And as a tax collector, he saw all the corruption that came from a corrupt system and the suspicions and paranoia that go along with who's going to take over or who's going to defy the king. So it didn't make much sense to him, and he was kind of appalled by the whole thing. He did, however, in these halls, met meet Benjamin Franklin in London. And so he was given a notice that he could go to the United States as a letter of introduction with Franklin's name on it. And he sailed to the colony, specifically Philadelphia. He barely made it because he was so sick going on the voyage. But when he made it, he became a publisher right away with some connections. And in 1774, 1775, he became the editor of an anti-slavery journal at a time when it wasn't very popular anyplace. And then he also, as they say in the Declaration of Independence, in the course of human events, when the time occurred, he was very mysterious now. He wrote and published a small pamphlet in early 1776. He called it Plain Truth. But his friends told him to change it to Common Sense. And there he did. And because he wrote in plain language, pretty bold and somewhat pretty offensive, but that's how people talk, the common person in the colonies talk, not with the King's English. He wrote this Common Sense. He said that there's no reason whatsoever to have heretical monarchies, which are obsolete, unjust. There are nobilities fawning over them to see who would get pleasure of the king. He said nobilities were really people with no ability. And so America, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, and he said from the American colonies, miles and miles across the ocean, there was no reason to have a king in the first place. So that was in the pamphlet, Common Sense. It made no common sense. But he also said toward the end of the pamphlet that America could be a beacon light for all of humanity and all of the enslaved countries, from kings on to colonies. And this would be an opportunity to develop a universal, in his words, a universal society. And that meant brotherhood and universal human rights, so that people wouldn't be steal something at 10 a.m., be put to the court by 12 noon and hanged in the gallows at 1 o'clock, that was the crudity of the time. And so he had in the back of his pamphlet, Common Sense, the rudiments of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Common Sense was read by 1 out of every 4 colonists, but there wasn't an internet, there wasn't radio, there wasn't any media, there was horseback at best, and that was it, no automobiles. So how did this spread so fast that within 6 months of July 1776, you had the Declaration of Independence? Something mysterious about the way Thomas Paine spoke and the way and the power of his pen ignited the imagination, but really ignited it such that farmers would give up their farms, risk their families, be treasonous, and fight off the largest empire in the world, the British. It was kind of amazing. So Paine's Common Sense was a catalyst for the American Revolution. And he was also with George Washington while his troops fought the British and lost this battle and that battle and was running away. George Washington was a master of escape as a general. But then they were kind of pinned up in this river. And that's where Thomas Paine gave, again, his tremendous rhetoric, but it had so much power behind it, that these are the times that try men's souls. And that we have to go beyond just being a summer soldier and fight for these principles. Lo and behold, Washington came up with a surprise attack at night, and the series of losses and financial losses as well to pay the troops, all those began to turn, and what seemed like a hopeless cause actually turned after that incident. So as I said, Thomas Paine was somewhat mysterious, but he had a major contribution. But he certainly was one of the gold standards of revolution, because he was like Thomas Jefferson, successful in ensuring freedom of conscience, of individual conscience, and of separating religion from government. All the governments had state religions, and if you weren't part of the state religion, you were kind of second class, if not persecuted. And this happened in many places in the world, and even somewhat in the colony. But he and Jefferson were successful in separating religion from government and to not have any privileged state religion. So that allowed for freedom of conscience. He was also, as our colleague Jim Tepper has written, indomitable in the cause for independence and free of the major vices of his time. He was free of slavery, he didn't own any slaves, monetary greed, or political ambition. He was against militarism, the corruption of war, and was very suspicious and tried his best to keep Great Britain from colonizing not only America, but other places, even asking Ireland if they would revolt against England because Britain would be such a colonizing agent. So he said, we have it in our power to begin the world again. And that had such a kind of strength. So his litmus tests were many, but certainly twofold. One, he spoke about the need for unity, that if we have unity, there's so much strength in unity, much stronger, in fact, than numbers, if you have unity about a just cause. And you might remember that it was Abraham Lincoln, also self-taught, who read Common Sense and read about unity and union as being the primary factor in working toward justice. And in fact, that's, if you read the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's major goal above all was to keep the unity of the United States of America. So it was because of reading Paine that he was really influenced by this. But on a more practical level, another litmus test for Paine would be, when you looked at a civilization, how many prisoners do they have? And how do they treat their deviants? And if you apply that criteria today to America, you would see that America might be far off from what Thomas Paine and others would think would be a kind of universal just civilization. So those were kind of two litmus tests. Now, how does spiritual evolution kind of come into this? Well, just one more quote. Paine wrote, the present civilization, he was talking about his, but you might apply it to some of ours. The present civilization is as odious as it is unjust. The contrast of the affluence and the wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together. So you can't be pretty much more explicit than that. What were some of Paine's views then? First, what were his views about God? Well, Paine felt that the universe is the Bible of a true, what he would term himself, a theophilanthropist, a lover of God and man. It is there that we can read a God. It is through the universe that proof of his existence are to be sought and to be found. As to written or printed books, by whatever name they are called, they are works of man's hands and carry no evidence in themselves that God is the author of any of them. It must be in something that man cannot make that we seek evidence for our belief that something is the universe, the true Bible, the inimitable work of God. So Paine would be described and has been described as a deist. He believed in divinity. And even though President Theodore Roosevelt, later on, 100 years later, called him a dirty little atheist, he was not an atheist. He believed in divinity. But nonetheless, in his deism, unlike some of the others, he believed that God was both transcendent not of this world, but also an intelligent spirit in everything manifest in this world. That God, the spark of God, the spirit of God is in everything, including us. And of course, our job is to kind of kindle that spark and see if we can light a fire in ourselves to become more inspired in our mind. And that the true deist then has one deity, he said, and religion consists in contemplating the power, wisdom, and benignity of the deity in his works. So we should endeavor to imitate the deity in every moral, scientific, and mechanical work, because he believed God was in everything. Everything was the divine. Everything had a spiritual basis, including principles of science, he said, or of divine origin. We can't make it up or invent these principles. We can only discover them. So as for religion, Paine spoke out very strongly against literal and sometimes organized religion, because for Paine, reason and the development of reason was very important. That if life was to become a library where each can learn the grammar of God, study the lessons of nature, and act in harmony and justice with natural law, then this would be the true pathway to the divine. And through our participation in the unfolding of this cosmos, we're not outside nature or separate from nature, we're in it, participating. It may be too much to say that we're small co-creators, but we may very well be. And so for Paine, faith must stand to reason. It wasn't necessarily either or, but faith had to stand to reason, because this is what he said. He said, it is only by the exercise of reason that we can discover God. Take away reason, and we would be incapable of understanding anything. So in this notion of reason, then, this rational study of nature, we try to look for principles, because everything originates with God. The eternal principles originate in the mind of God. So this is what he said about thinking. And I think we could all relate to this, right? And this is bringing the spiritual now into our minds as an inspiration. Paine said there are two classes of thoughts. Those we produce by our reflection and the act of thinking, and those that bolt into the mind of their own accord. I've always made it a rule to treat these voluntary visitors with civility, and it's from them, these bolts into the mind, that I have acquired almost all the knowledge I have. So the mind then becomes at once enlightened and serene at the same time. And so by having a serene mind and by worshiping or being devoted to deity, to the one without a second, so to speak, one can, over time, create a kind of serenity, and you never know when these bolts of intuition and these bolts of doing something good and being inspired will come into one's mind. It could come in during the shower, or it could come in through deep sleep and dreams, or in any part of your consciousness. But he suggested that these are important things that we ought to consider and cultivate. And not only did these principles then relate to the spiritual world, but also to the moral and social universe as well. He believed we were interdependent, and that's why, in order to accommodate these bolts of intuition and reasoning and inspiration in the mind, we needed universal human rights, but we could not consider them independently of social obligation. And I know there's a lot of emphasis, and maybe rightfully so, on human rights today. But we also have to consider what our social obligations are to our neighbors. We can't always rely on an outside source or a big agency to provide food if people are hungry. That it is our duty, in fact, Paine says this, the duty of man consists of two parts. His duty to God, which every man must feel, and with respect to his neighbor, do as he would be done by. Basically, the golden rule. So for Paine then, he actually believed that if we had a perfect civilization, people socially and would have the spirit and develop the wisdom to help each other. And thus we would have a need for less government and we could become more self-governing. And if you look at the history of the United States, as we do here on the 4th of July, we keep asking ourselves, how can we be more self-governing? And for Paine, he did not glamorize government. He said, society is produced by our wants. We can't fulfill everything because we need the affection as well as some of the resources of other people, right? But society is produced by our wants. Government is produced by our wickedness. Because the former, society, is produced by our happiness in our uniting of our affections. But government, the other, is by laws restraining our vices. So there is a necessity of some form of government to supply the defects in our moral virtue, because we're not angels and we're not perfect. Paine was a very practical person, to provide freedom and human rights. But he also felt that it was really important for society and for social relations to expand its vision toward each other. They used to call it sociability. But to try not to be separate and separateness, but to see all of us as part of one human family and not as a separate individual, as separateness, because that's kind of an illusion. Now, when we get to political representation, Paine believed that, okay, when you grow in size beyond a family or a series of families or a tribe, you need to have some kind of representation, and that's where representative democracy came in. And it must be capable of embracing, and the key word here is confederating, all various interests and every extent of territory and population, with advances much superior to hereditary authority. So for Paine, law was the king. And he substituted a written constitution for the arbitrariness of the king's personality and proclivities. Oh, I like him, I don't like him, I'll give him some money and a license, I won't give him, he threatens me, da, da, da. So for Paine said, we have to advance beyond that, and by a written constitution will provide a measure of trust in the law and thus in each other. And while it is very, very imperfect, because we are very imperfect, at least it's some kind of reflection of natural law, of some kind of trying to promote harmony and some kind of justice, even if it's terribly imperfect. And so for Paine, he was then had this vision that was what Athens was in miniature for Greece and the polis, that somehow we always look back to democracy and to Greece. I don't really know why, but there must be a spiritual reason. Mainly because most of the people were not free. Women couldn't vote. They had mostly slaves. But nonetheless, Athens is a prototype of, was in miniature what he thought America could be in magnitude for all peoples. That America is for everyone on the globe. And that this was the start, you have to start somewhere, the start of a great beacon light of liberty and equality and fraternity. And the way to handle this at a larger level with more population and size was through a confederation. But where did he learn this from? Paine, Franklin, and Jefferson at one time or another met with the native Iroquois Indian Confederation, the 6 tribes of the Northeast. And the Iroquois schooled them in the arts of confederation and evolving fraternity, of how you get the different tribes from different geographic areas to deal with each other. And in fact, Native Americans, of course, in the United States and elsewhere are very diverse, so you can't say one thing about them all. But they knew something about spiritual democracy. Many of them did. They knew, for example, that before you entered a dialogue or deliberate, you have to let go of nagging emotions. Thus, you have chants, festivals, sacred rites to get you in the right mindset to deliberate. That way, in deliberation, one could let the spirit in. The spirit of the sun, of nature, of ancestors, of the collective wisdom of nature, and the collective wisdom of the tribe before making a decision. This is spiritual democracy. They really didn't prefer hotheads. And through rituals, chants, traditions, the elders who were wise tried to reduce the hot-headedness so that people would come in as cool heads. People were cool, with a measure of devotion to something beyond themselves, to a common good for all the tribe. And in the case of a confederation, all the confederation. Well, the first government of the United States of America, to no surprise, was the Articles of Confederation, not the US Constitution. The only reason it failed, there are a number of reasons, but the corruption was so great in the States that something else had to be done. But they did try, taking the idea of the Iroquois Indians, although also the Swiss had a confederation as well. And they really tried to look for something where the common good can take place to draw everyone together. Well, to conclude, one of the first labor organizers in modern India, B.P. Wadia, and a philosopher, then defined democracy. And the Greeks defined it as demos, people, and krotos, strength or power of the people. So it's kind of like the power of the people. But it goes beyond the political sense. It means the strength of the people to exercise their spiritual will, their will in action. Hopefully, wise action. And we know that native peoples totally understood this and developed rituals, cultures, chants, ways of reorienting the mind from the mundane to the spiritual, to the sacred. And that's exactly what, in fact, a true democracy has to do as well, because it has to take the good of the whole of mankind now into consideration, because we're now global, as we all know. We're all suffering globally, as we all know. Everyone has turned back on themselves, not just with COVID, but with a variety of things going on right now. So we really need to go back and establish what B.P. Wadia says is a feeling of fraternity, brotherhood, and self-sacrifice for the whole. And that's what's missing. From the revolutions, we got liberty, equality, and fraternity, but people forgot the fraternity. And they never did. And somehow, because people were on their interests all the time. I'm always on my interests. Don't put that in my backyard. You know, it's none of my interest. And an interest is just our outer shell. It's like the husk, not the essence. And we're so far on interest that we forgot. We started bargaining and jockeying for a position around interest rather than expressing love and fraternity. Even in the US Congress a few years ago, people would go out with each other and it really was a fraternity. And now it's like the opposite party is like a demon or something. is worse than the devil, and they won't speak to them at all, and they're afraid they'll get a news clip that'll then be put on television speaking to the enemy, the other party. No fraternity. So that's really where we are right now in our contemporary revolution, is to try to develop a consciousness for the whole human family by having a more serene mind, by acknowledging people's suffering, and from trying to move from selfishness to brotherhood, the Dalai Lama might say from economic values to true universal values of love and compassion, so we can move to what Thomas Paine called his goal, a universal society. And all of this is akin to the very beautiful aloha spirit that was described last week. So we need to rekindle what's already in our hearts, but somehow we have trouble expressing it. Something akin to the aloha spirit. So we're open for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Maurice. So much of what you said just is lighting up all kinds of ideas and questions in my mind. I know that from the Hawaiian tradition, a lot of our, I would say, universal laws, how we create space, is based on universal truths, like the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, the path of rain through the aquifer down to the ocean. And I'm really interested in what you mentioned about Thomas Paine describing natural law. And I was just curious if you could just share a few examples of what are examples of natural law by Thomas Paine. Like, to me, I would think that is something that is universally true. So I'm curious from his point of view.
Yes, thank you. Very good question. Well, for one thing, we could start with the sky and the cosmos. That Paine pointed out that the planets move around the sun, and we can all see this. And we all, maybe there's some exceptions, but most people wouldn't claim they made it. A few people might, but most people would say, well, I didn't make that. But Paine would also suggest that that's the visible part. But behind the visible is the invisible, that there are planetary spirits, that each planet represents certain kinds of wonderful qualities that they move around. And the sun itself represents not just the physical sun, but the spiritual sun, or what Plato would call the good that you can't define, but you know is there. The good that you know has movement, because the sun as well as the planets move. So this is like God's movement. And so this is kind of the basis for natural law. But then when we use our light of understanding that's in us, from the spirit and from the sun, the spiritual sun, as well as our physical sun, we find that each human being has a certain kind of equality, an equality of potential to have conscience, to be creative, to be able to reason with faith, to be able to test that reason. And that's where natural law kind of comes in, is that does that meet the test of natural law? Aren't all human beings, don't they have the same potential, the same light in them to express themselves? And so to do it imperfectly, we have to use our reason and reason together. And where democracy kind of comes into it is democracy does have a corrective, is that by reasoning together, or even by elections or sorting out by lot who's going to represent us and this and that, we get to correct ourselves. And so there's kind of a built-in self-correction, a check on ourselves, so we don't get all full of ourselves. But at the same time, we move to some justice and some harmony. So natural law really involves being harmonious. And when things are disharmonious, it's not very just after a while. Sometimes you need disharmony to get to harmony, but nonetheless, we're moving toward greater and greater harmony. And Paine thought that we can use our minds and our hearts to be able to apprehend this, and then to help us reason and reason together with each other. So natural law is very important so that we don't get locked into just the dead letter of the law, which is the other kind of law, and lawyers and accountants and all the stuff that we get all bogged down with now. But somehow we lost natural law because everyone's on the positive law, this other kind of law. So natural law is a really important idea to keep kindling our conscience and getting us in touch with the real truth that comes from our light of understanding. Others may have some other views on that, and would it be helpful?
Thank you. I particularly love the idea of being able to have reason and to test reason as a means of self-correction and recalibration. I think that's fantastic. Thank you.
I have a question, Maurice. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm wondering about spiritual democracy. Do you think that Paine's statement that each man's mind is his own church has a bearing or some relationship to spiritual democracy? That each man's mind is his own church?
Well, yes, I think it relates to a combination of freedom of conscience, but beyond freedom of conscience, it's the ability to work out reason and to stand faith to reason. And so each person must reason for themselves and actually find their own way to some extent by themselves. No one else can really do it for you, because this is, inspiration is an inside job. And so it's through the Spirit, through our inspiration, that we have to create our own perspiration. Some of you have heard this before, I'm sure. So we can have a healthy respiration. So it starts from within, without, and that means that each person has to really be their own church. And that means having moral courage. And Gandhi, of course, spoke a lot about moral courage, because to stand up to what everyone else believes is true but might be unjust, or to speak up to the power structure that doesn't want to hear about it. We're all faced with that all the time, actually, maybe too often. So it is very important that we use our own mind as our own church. We could test it against what the spiritual teachers have told us, both in books and spiritual teachers we might have as ideals.
There's some movement in the sustainability arena to recognize animals, to recognize different spots in nature, different sacred places as entities unto themselves, deserving of their own rights. And I'm wondering what you think Tom Paine might think of that, and whether that has any bearing on this concept of spiritual democracy.
Well, I think it goes back again to the idea of natural law, because natural law doesn't apply, it applies to all beings. That includes nature. And we're part of nature. Nature isn't separate from us, or nature isn't just out there. It's our own natures too. And I'm sure we've all felt in the last few months our inner nature being a little turbulent with what's going on here and there, along with maybe the way we think about things. So Paine's idea of natural law and Paine's idea of justice relative to natural law would include all living things, all of nature, because all of nature has its own intrinsic qualities, and all of nature is harmonious with each other. We are all interdependent. We all contribute to each other. So without nature, it's obvious, without a sacred seed or sacred soil, if we don't treat it as sacred, we may not get the quality that we need in our food. And so there's a mutual reciprocity between human beings and the way we think about things and nature. And so we should definitely include all living things. And intrinsically, in natural law, which should be translated into positive law as well if needed, to make sure that we protect, sustain the sacredness of nature, because Paine said that all things are divine, essentially divine and source of divine. And that means that we're not separate, we're kin with nature. They're our family, along with the family of man. So we have to cultivate our heart and our mind, and by going within to our inner understanding of the divine, and then be inspired to come out with reason and perspective, and a broader perspective that takes into account all of nature.
Democracy, I think, demos has to do with people, and crasy has to do with law or governance.
And power of the people. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering whether this concept of a representative democracy would help to take care of this point, that there are these elements of nature, for example, just as there are aspects of human society that may not be able to represent themselves. Certainly nature cannot represent itself in a democracy's governing body. Maybe this idea of representative democracy would allow for these aspects of nature to be carefully taken into consideration of what is the best for the whole.
What we need basically, and what some communities have, is you need a democracy of a community of place. The democracy, the representatives are from a particular place. And in that place includes nature. It includes the sacredness of seeds, the sacredness of the cycles. That's part of the natural law, right, or the cycles of nature. And so people need to attend to these. And so you need representatives, whether they're elders or whether they're elected or whatever, who understand and appreciate those, that have a consciousness, if you will. It's all really about consciousness, so that they represent and appreciate and love the whole. And so much of what we have are larger interests and corporate interests and regional interests and other interests, which are not locally based. So they have no clue, nor are they particularly interested if they want to maximize a profit in land development, et cetera. And they have money and they can just railroad the land, railroad the laws. So we need very vibrant and strong communities of place, land, that have representatives and could withstand the external intrusions from people that have less appreciation, shall we say, for nature. Also, judicially, I'm not an expert on this, but they are trying to represent nature, especially animals, and their interests in court cases now. But I think that's I think that's useful, but I think the main thing is that we are nature and we are part of these cycles and we depend on these cycles. These cycles are sacred. And in my opinion, there needs to be a veto, not just checks and balances between the Congress, the legislature, and the courts and the executive, but checks and balances between the bigger units that have certain needs and the smaller units of place that also have needs, so that each one could veto each other. And my experience, I won't go into it now, is that if they respect each other's veto, they'll respect each other and you can come up with creative solutions, rather than the larger people coming in and imposing, quote, democracy on the smaller units of place.
I'd like to mention one other thing about animals, and to what Renee was asking earlier. It's interesting that someone like Jeremy Bentham, who developed the theory of utilitarianism, but he was protective of animals. He didn't believe in animal cruelty. And he made the point, until a country, a people, realize the following: it's not a question of whether animals can reason or speak. The question is, can animals suffer? To me, that hits the nail on the head. We all recognize suffering as a universal phenomenon, and we all have instant sympathy and empathy for it. So if we can see animals as beings that suffer, I mean, by human beings making them suffer, then that should bring out something of our compassion and recognition of their place in the world. As you say, we're not separate from them. So that seemed to me interesting point Jeremy Bentham was making.
We really just have to raise our vision, think global, act local. But you can reverse it too. You could say think local and act global, because there's global suffering, but to save our seeds, to save the fertility of our land, that's happening all over. I mean, look at what's happening at the Amazon and the cutting of the forests. That's for the earth. That's how the earth breathes, through its forests and through its trees. So we definitely have a big job ahead of us, but one that we could do if we just think about the family, not just the whole human family, but the whole family of nature. And one of the ways to start, as Gandhi pointed out, is with ourselves. He always talks about starting with yourself, right? And we can begin to simplify some of our own needs by subtracting our wants from our needs. So we all have wants. We like this and we like that. And quite frankly, in America lives like a luxurious society compared to the rest of the world. It uses 40% of the world's resources. I mean, it's like every person demands luxury. And of course, that's where you get people that lose their moral sense because they get flabby. They just want to protect what they have. They don't care. And really comes down to the opposite of love. What is the opposite of love? It's not hate, it's indifference. And when you get this rich and poor, as Payne pointed out, this wretchedness in that quote, it's very difficult to bridge the gap between when you become luxurious, you then become indifferent to those who, because you feel guilty inside, because that's a truth that you're taking away from someone else, and that's the inner truth. And so, but you don't want to deal with that, so you create gates around your community and this and that. And we just have to, I think what's going on now is kind of an uncovering, and we are having an eclipse, I think today actually as well. All of these kinds of natural phenomena are kind of opening up things so that whatever has been lying underneath can get surfaced with the light of understanding, even though it's painful. So there's real hope that there's starting to be a real shift in consciousness, not in everyone, but in furthering the good.
I'm wondering if Malia, who spoke to us as a representative from the Hawaiian tradition last week, and the power of language, could speak to us maybe in closing about some of the ways today that, even if you were to only speak from the Hawaiian tradition, Malia, that we're beginning to pay more attention to the voice of nature and how that might be better represented as we move forward in the world.
Thank you, Renée, for the question. Often when I try to think deeper into an issue, I try to go back to as universal truths as I can to help to just give me a sense of grounding. And I would think back to the Kumulipo, which is our chant of creation. It's one of it's our chants of, it's our cosmology. It's It's where and how life began. And it's famous, I'd say, in Hawaii for having like dozens and dozens of pairs of living creatures or living beings. So there's something of the ocean that is paired with something of the land, something in the sea, something in the mountains. And the language of these pairings includes kia'i'ia'e, which is guarded by. And so I think there's something really important about relationship between these different groupings and having a sense of guarding and caring for each other, creating a balance between. It's not just opposites happening in a vacuum. And so I think that that level of connection is something that Hawaiians understand deeply. The kalo, which is our staple food, we regard it as our elder brother. You know, it's born of the gods before people. And so we look at the land as familial. It's our family. We have this drive to not only acknowledge, but to protect and to keep each other. And so I think that that is something that it's the root of compassion. You know, compassion, which is understanding, you know, the suffering of another and wanting to help. And so when we are able to create our understanding of relationship, I think with the kumulipo, going to that balance between opposites, that's a really important clue.
Yes, very much so.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I really want to appreciate the depth of understanding you unfolded for us, Maurice. You showed us aspects of the history of this country, which we celebrate today, the Declaration of Independence. And there are aspects of what went on in this country coming into being that you unfolded for us that probably many of us were not aware of. Taking us back to the Iroquois Confederation, for example. Many of us probably did not realize that our own country's original governmental document was based on a Native American document, or a Native American format. And then I also wanted to thank you for, as you were speaking of natural law, as you were speaking of representing the whole of nature as a manifestation of the divine, you gave a very telling to me example of the kind of sense of relationship that Malia is talking about when you spoke of the Amazon, and with that forest being decimated, we are making it more and more difficult for the earth itself to breathe. And so when we think of what Jim brought up as from Jeremy Bentham, that animals may not be able to speak or reason as we do, but can they suffer? Yes, they can. And then you broadened it out. The earth itself is and can suffer. And so that too needs to be taken into consideration, guarded and protected in a true spiritual democracy. So thank you really, really so much for the depth of your presentation today. Truly appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for spending some time on the 4th of July.
Maurice, that was lovely.